Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to my presentation on organizational support practices for prosocial work, internalizing prosocial motives in moving sports clubs. This paper is part of a wider project on prosocial motivation in moving sports clubs. And this paper is written by myself, Anne-Marie Loken, and my supervisor, Arne Kons. Thank you so much for all of you who are watching this, and equally to those of you who have read the paper, big thank you. And I'm really looking forward to getting some constructive and healthy criticism on this. So just to give you a quick overview of the paper, we have quite a limited amount of time. So this is going to be very brief and very quick. So this paper sort of started, first of all, by looking at all the research that has surrounded prosocial motivation. And what we see is that it seems to be very important for intrinsic motivation and prosocial motivation to sort of work together, take hold and have an effect for beneficiaries. So what do we mean by that? When individuals are both intrinsically and prosocially motivated at work, it seems to have positive outcome for the beneficiaries who are receiving help, help from those individuals. Equally, it seems also to have more positive impact on the individuals themselves and the organizations. So this is sort of a key thing that is highlighted in the literature. However, there seems to be scant work on what organizations can actually do to support this sort of gradual internalizing of prosocial movements over time in organizations. And this paper explores specifically organizational support practices for prosocial work. And we're looking at extreme cases, specifically 2 professional sports clubs in Norway that are very, very good at organizing a range of prosocial work activities. So players in these clubs, specifically we're looking at ice hockey club and a football club, and these players are mandated or obligated to take part in different forms of prosocial activities that at first glance have little to do with work. So you might suggest, say, what does a football player, what does his work have to do with community work or visiting sick, cancerous children? Well, perhaps this has got something to do with their work over time. But these players, anyhow, they are sort of mandated then to visit terminally ill children in hospitals or visit schools where they talk about difficult life choices and challenges that they've dealt with. And this is sort of seen in these organizations as a way of developing and educating human beings in these clubs. Our tentative evidence suggests that for some of these players and organizations for staff that we have talked to, and equally we've been in the field, but it's just some of these players and organizations for staff talk about these experiences as intensity or something that means a lot to them after having multiple encounters with prosocial work activities. So how can organizations support practices for prosocial work contribute to shape the internalizing of prosocial movements over time? Very quickly, this is the agenda. So I'm really going to give you a brief overview of the theorizing on prosocial motivation and work. A little bit about the research questions, the context, the design, and finally the findings. And what I'm really looking forward to getting feedback on in terms of this presentation is that we know that the data that you've, for those of you who read the paper, the data that's structured today, most of that is interview data, right? So we're really looking to get some of the observational data in as well, in terms of structuring and giving more sort of rich contextual evidence to this paper. So for those of you who are experienced researchers or have done a lot of qualitative research, feel free to hit me up with an email or a link to a good paper or any sort of constructive feedback. Is very, very much appreciated, okay? So in order to do phenomenon-based research, it's really useful to work out from the definition. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about prosocial motivation work? Well, the definition that I work out from is the desire to promote and protect well-being in the workplace. And the key word here is the word desire. Because as we know, having a desire is not necessarily something that you have consistently all the time. So, and as such, the literature shows that, well, prosocial motivation work fluctuates all the time. So some individuals can temporarily desire, but some individuals also persist to want to benefit specific groups of people. So you can develop this sort of consistent persistence to want to benefit specific groups of people all the time. So most of the research to date, a lot of it has been quantitative. So hence we have chosen this qualitative angle to look at practice perspective. Whereas the quantitative research or the laboratory experiments and field studies that we've seen today, really, really useful to draw on to understand what to expect under certain conditions. However, these study designs have these sort of pre-decided predicated circumstances. And it talks about potential mechanisms to enhance the internalizing prosocial motivation work, but it says little about the sort of dynamicism or the temporal aspects of what's happening in organizations over time in terms of practices that we maintain and keep and do every day, and and to what degree are those actually structured? Because that can be probably a bit muddling as well. So the research on prosocial motivation work is diverging, as we know, into three separate streams of research. And all of these three streams, sort of prosocial motivation, which is sort of future desire, interest to help others. We've got prosocial behaviors, which is the numerous benefiting others, helping behaviors that you do, and these studies count, and then what you get. And then there are studies on prosocial impact, and that's looking back at these types of behaviors have this positive impact on others and how this happens. Whereas all these three streams seem to have this variable results. So what they're talking about is saying that there's this sort of bright side of being prosocial work and this dark side too, depending on the level of internalization. So there's creates a sort of dichotomy suggesting that the sort of extrinsic side of prosocial motivation is essentially burdensome for individuals, groups, and organizations. There are few or no contextualized studies really on how organizations shape or support the internalizing process. So how does it really go from this extrinsic push to this intrinsic, or rather, how do we consistently maintain sort of intrinsic motivation to be social motivated at work? So how do organizations shape or support this internalizing process? So what's really interesting is our cases, contradictory to these studies, is that a lot of the prosocial activities seem to sort of be coming from the extrinsic side. So this is sort of organized by the personality itself. So that is where we have a little bit of an interesting twist. So I'm not going to go through this because we're really limited on time. But the individual level literature, as I just said, this sort of highlights this intrinsic side of prosocial motivation, where this extrinsic side seems to potentially burden individuals. However, perhaps more interesting for us when we're talking about this is that studies also show, so experimental studies show, that individuals who are prosocially motivated at work are also willing to sort of break rules, demonstrate honesty, and violate ethical standards, all mainly being prosocial. So perhaps we should be a little bit more concerned about how or what organizations can do to shape or support this sort of internalizing prosocial motivation, because it can also lead to these sort of bad behaviors. So perhaps the sort of process itself is important, or practices that organizations keep to sort of maintain prosocial motivation in sort of the positive sense. So we mainly draw on the work design literature and some psychological research to illustrate why social context and social experiences are potentially important for internalizing prosocial motivation. Relational work design literature is particularly helpful, which builds on the classic work design literature. And this stresses the relational aspects of how individuals interact and actually work in. So Grant suggests that individuals can internalize prosocial motivation at work through developing effective commitment to others and awareness to making a positive difference. However, we're not really, how does this happen? And Grant talks a little bit about the opportunity structures that might be particularly important. So my employer could potentially impact, say, to what degree, if I have a job and my job affects your job. So my employer can potentially structure my job to make me have to interact with more people, and my job to affect other people, and thereby I might be more aware of how my work impacts you, and therefore I might develop more awareness of how my work is affecting you. So there is something about physical proximity, about the scope, the magnitude, and these kinds of things, and how we interact with each other work that potentially structural elements can be important. But these structural elements can also be important for the relational aspects of how much we need to interact and talk to each other, right? So he talks a little bit about this, but again, we're trying to study this in an organizational context where we can see this sort of happening in practice and how this sort of unfolds over time. So we also draw on psychological research because I think it's interesting and important to highlight that there's been a lot of work on internalizing and developing prosocial motivation in childhood. And this is interesting because perhaps this is also relevant for adults. So we know that children are encouraged and rewarded for being helpful. So they receive praise and other social rewards. And internalizing prosocial motivation actually can be a general socialization process in many cultures. It's sort of, this is how we behave, and it's also social modeling effect. So this also builds on sort of psychological viewpoints of sort of social work, so feeling important for others, so doing things for others, is sort of maybe a fundamental human need that we have as human beings. Equally, some narrative researchers, really interesting as well, where we see that individuals can become more prosocial in later life stages, to the extent that it's not necessarily in childhood alone. We do see adults becoming more prosocial, for example, when they have children. For example, maybe career can have something to do with it. We need more evidence to talk about this amongst us adults. How does this develop in later life stages? So our research questions are: how do organizational support practices potentially sort of shape actors internalizing prosocial motives over time? Or what types of organizational support practices do we actually see or hear about that allow individuals to be experienced sort of internalizing, right? So our research context, as I just specified, so keep an eye on the time, working with Norwegian sports clubs that seem to have little to do with prosocial work on the surface, including one football club and one ice hockey club is our sort of comparative approach. And they organize a wide portfolio of prosocial work. So not only do the players sort of visit sort of terminal children and children in schools, talk about stuff. These clubs also have sports groups or sort of teams for people with mental health problems, people with substance abuse disorders, people with Down syndrome. So they organize different teams to sort of have a more inclusive environment to engage a range of people from the community. Equally, they host specific sports events where they raise money for a lot of charitable causes, and equally highlight and talk about these charitable causes. So creating an impact and an importance around these big topics, so they can sort of be this communication channel to highlight difficult issues. And these players, they have a sort of this choice to engage in these things. So of course, this is a dual mission. It's not sort of generally just for social. Of course, there are this dual aspect of these things. It's to do and make positive difference for others, but it's equally about strengthening the club's image, public image in the local community. And this seems obviously quite natural. So after having a lot of conversations with players and club members, the origin of these activities in both clubs seems to stem back to the cultural and ethical ideals of sports clubs, and equally that the first accounts were initiated by the players having desires themselves to give back to the local communities. So when we think back in Norwegian sports clubs compared to those of you in the UK or in the rest of Europe, in Norway, it's only in the last 10 years really where we've seen that sports clubs have become a lot more professional and commercialized, because they've grown and they have a lot more money now. And whereas before, the sort of pro-social work was more sort of random, perhaps, or maybe beneficiaries sort of say, oh, okay, they come visit us, and like, sure, we can do this. Now, when they become more professional, commercialized, pro-social work has subsequently become a lot more systematic. So it's a lot more structured. These clubs now have their own employees who do all the coordinating and organizing of these activities to make sort of a cleaner and more consistent delivery in terms of this pro-social work. So that's important to keep in mind. And as we earlier on we said, the tentative evidence here suggests that some of the players and organizational sports staff in particular that we talked to, for some of these people, these experiences, they have become intensely meaningful. They generally really seem to care and have really valued this work. And it seems to almost enter their sense of self to some extent. So the research design is qualitative. We're studying a prototypical context, so we're studying extreme cases. And again, this is interesting because the tension between extrinsic motivation and prosocial motivation is accentuated. And this is also interesting, as early on we said, this theoretical evidence suggests that prosocial motivation should be fully internalized to have successful results, whereas we're saying, hey, this is coming quite extrinsically, but this is happening over time as we're engaging with this work. So this is a comparative case analysis of the organizational practices for supporting prosocial work in two sports clubs, the Ice Hockey Club and a football club in Norway. And the cases here were chosen based on a purposive stratified sampling. We sought cases intense on the phenomena of an investigation, and we were trying to look at the variation between them. I don't think we'll have time to talk too much about the variation, but I will quickly go over the organizational support practices that we found, okay? So feel free to read the paper or look more into the presentation to look more at details. So this paper aims to contribute to the work design literature, potentially also the literature on job crafting, by identifying what types of organizational support practices exist out there today. So what do we see that we can actually structure a name and put words on that we see is happening in real life? And how and why are these potentially important for shaping how actors and players are internalizing prosocial motivation work? And we illustrate these practices as actually they form this iterative experiential learning process in the prosocial realm. So we're saying that together these form a way of learning experientially. So by going through these different, having these different experiences, this can help you learn and understand and gain perspectives of these different types of experiences. So we found 4 sets of recurrent organizational support practices for prosocial work that have a potential bearing on internalizing of prosocial movements. Whereas the first one is this sort of motivational preference. We found these 2 different practices for motivational preference. First one, storytelling or sharing stories of impact, and the second was social modeling of values. Second one, more functional crafting, the way these organizations craft activities and roles. Third, the actual doing of prosocial seems also to be important. You have to actually have had the experience. It's not just about hearing it, talking about it. It's also about doing it. And then finally, we have some preliminary findings around the post-experiential reflection through this developmental debriefing around these experiences. To further illustrate, I have this model here for you to make it a little bit more easier to see what we do. So, organizational support practices for social work. Here we see the motivational prepping, and we have these 2 patterns here. So the first pattern concerns the practices of gathering and sharing stories from previous encounters with beneficiaries. So this is different organizational support staff, also the players and staff, talk about all these stories. And this takes place through internal media, in the internal or external presentations, or in conversations. So this could be informal conversations between organizations and players, and we also see these sometimes in the media communicated outwards. And the way of sharing these stories demonstrates possible impact that is meant to facilitate sort of this perspective taking amongst players, as well as having potential agenda for self-promotion. So having done these activities and having done something good for others also makes one sometimes feel good about oneself. And equally, the club having a more positive image. Just keeping an eye on time here. For the former agenda, one may say that rich storytelling is a way of textured forms of communication, such as Carlson et al. In 2012. So these are ways of socially embedding prosocial work as a positive organizational practice that augment the possibility of alternative realities. So by invoking imagination. So when we talk about stories, it invokes our imagination, and perhaps you could feel that you were there, you were experiencing by talking about it in a very rich and vivid way, about the sounds, about the smells, about the laughter, about the feelings, the emotions, what we saw when we were there. We can start to imagine what you could be experiencing. So this can be a way of prepping players and also other staff in terms of what to expect when you're in a prosocial routine. The second process pattern is also a form of motivational prepping, and one is set up to socially model desired prosocial behavior. So here we have, in these clubs, we have sports directors and other key personnel who demonstrate prosocial behaviors and related values in everyday life. So the overall function here is not only to prepare players and other staff for prosocial work, but also to integrate a prosocial agenda in itself as part of the club culture, in action and in talk. So it's not only about saying, you should do good things, it's also about going around and doing them. And they go around and do this, right? So both of these clubs have sports directors who value prosocial work as an important practice for developing human beings. I actually see this as a way of educating their players to be better for the future. Sorry about that noise. May I have a little dog down here. The third observed support practice is about crafting activities and roles in prosocial work. So this is about maintaining, scheduling, and coordinating a portfolio of prosocial work activities, including scripting roles and preparing players. Such crafting of or activities and role is a form of functional crafting that enables skill development in players and offers choice. So having a wider portfolio of prosocial work can engage players in numerous opportunity structures and showcase multiple dimensions for getting into contact with beneficiaries. It also illustrates the sort of the feeling of being autonomous, because they're to some degree obligated or mandated to engage in different social work activities, but here they get the function of choice, right? So we have this portfolio, you have to pick one. Which one do you find most interesting? Which one would you like to get involved in? So to some degree, the functional nature of this prepping in terms of planning or structuring for social work also intersects with the motivational prepping. So it's a way of sort of negotiating which role, and this is also about the experiential legitimacy, and this is typically prior to a social work activity as a way of clarifying expectations. So clarifying, okay, so you want to be part of, okay, do you want to visit the street team, or do you want to visit the school, or do you want to be part of the hospital gang? So in this sense, it becomes to some degree autonomous. And the scope and magnitude for social work in these clubs is wide, as I said. They do so many different things. And this also integrates numerous different types of people in the social context of these clubs. And it allows the players and the actors in these clubs to experience exposure to social work and different types of people. And the role for engaging in socially embedded and socially embedded and dynamic at the same time. So the level of engaging varies from being sort of very minimalistic, so some players hardly engage, to more autonomous, to the extent that it's sort of built on some sort of gradual interaction. And the perceived job impact and effective commitment to beneficiaries in these social work activities may be bounded by several structures in the opportunities, such as the magnitude, the scope, frequency and prevention focus on the job impact on the beneficiaries, and frequency, duration, physical proximity, depth, and breadth of the beneficiary. So what do I mean by this is, for example, that one visit to the children's hospital possibly has a limited impact, and I'm saying beneficiaries might experience that as really positive. However, on the player himself or the other organizations support staff, they only have one visit at one time to that one hospital. It might have a limited impact in terms of the magnitude, considering the players in these systems. They're not saving lives by going to visit a terminally ill child. However, when you have recurrent visits, more frequent, and that intensify the perceived impact of what you're doing, so you're feeling that you're making a more and more of an impact on these people's lives, this can be enriching, an enriching experience for players and beneficiaries because of the close physical proximity. So, if you're seeing this sick child on numerous instances, you're developing a relationship, right? And the depth in terms of the seriousness of the situation. So this is serious. It's a child dying, potentially dying, or that they're dying, and someone suffering. That can really hit you, right? And the amount of gratitude expressions, positive affect that is exchanged. So seeing the happy child, experiencing their emotions, feeling that you're valued in that way can be immensely impactful. And the fourth support practice involves reflecting on experiences with players. So this is perhaps collectively, sometimes sort of driving at home in the car with all the players there, whether it be a hospital or a bus or whatever they're in, talking about what did we experience, how did we feel it, how was it, what did you see, what did you hear. So this could be collectively or one-to-one sessions. So we also hear about this, sports director who goes around, who talks to the player, and thank you for yesterday, and wow, that was really great what you did. So there's this aspect of affirmation and positive feedback in terms of the behavior that you did and the impact that you did and what you delivered for the job. And this is the opportunity to discuss not only the positive aspects of experience, but also the negative aspects, and give and receive feedback. And this works as a way to capitalize on mastery of the experience itself, build self-efficacy for doing prosocial work, and stimulate integrated growth in players. So developmental feedback also functions to gather stories for broader sharing to other players and external audiences. So it functions as a way to sort of to take this loop back to sharing stories of impact. So developmental debriefing is a way of collecting new stories to take back again, right, to further. So however, this developmental debriefing is typically informal, it's ad hoc in both clubs, thus incipient that established practices taking place after prosocial work. Collective debriefing aims to give supportive feedback and to potentially concern or raise issues that might also benefit other active players. This way of relieving tensions and negative feelings that may also be involved. It could be intensely difficult to see a really sick child dying of cancer. So these tensions might also need to be relieved afterwards. So I'm really sorry, but that's us out of time. Thank you so much. Any questions, feel free to post. There's more tables here, there's quotes. So feel free to check out the rest of the presentation online. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.